What if the 2026 WNBA season isn't hanging by a thread, but by a single date circled in red ink behind closed doors? Everyone keeps talking about revenue splits, percentages, fair shares, and growth. The headlines frame it like a normal labor disagreement. Players want more. Owners want control. Negotiations go back and forth. That's the public version. Clean, predictable, almost boring. But behind that polished surface, something much more aggressive is unfolding. Because this isn't just about how much money players receive. It's about timing. It's about pressure. And most importantly, it's about who blinks first when the clock stops being symbolic and starts becoming real. There's a belief floating around social media that the players hold all the leverage. After all, the league is experiencing unprecedented attention. Ticket demand is up. Corporate partnerships are stronger. Expansion is happening. The cultural spotlight has never burned brighter. Many fans assume ownership would never risk disrupting that momentum. But that assumption might be dangerously naive. Because the people running billion-dollar enterprises don't negotiate with emotion. They negotiate with structure, with timelines, with calculated risk. And if the latest developments are any indication, they may have just shifted the battlefield entirely. This isn't about a season opener in May. It's about something that happens long before that. A date that most fans weren't even paying attention to. A date that, if missed, doesn't just delay tip-off. It could fracture locker rooms, strain public perception, and completely reshape how this league's future is built. And here's the twist no one wants to admit. The very spotlight that was supposed to protect the players may now be the thing squeezing them the hardest. So before we jump to conclusions about who's right, who's wrong, and who should cave, we need to understand the real pressure point in this entire standoff. Because once you see the timeline clearly, everything changes. Let's start with the date that quietly turned into a ticking clock. Everyone keeps pointing to May 8th. Opening night. The moment fans expect arenas buzzing, broadcasts rolling, and storylines exploding into a brand new season. That's the date splashed across promotional materials. That's the date people think matters most. But May 8th is a distraction. The real deadline comes nearly 2 months earlier. March 10th. That's the date insiders are whispering about. The line in the sand that transforms this from a negotiation into a logistical emergency. And here's why that date is so powerful. Professional basketball doesn't magically appear when someone flips a switch. It's a chain reaction, a tightly choreographed sequence that has to happen in exact order, with legal clarity and financial structure guiding every step. Right now, a massive portion of the league's players are free agents. That means contracts are not locked in. Salaries aren't finalized. Teams don't even fully know what their rosters will look like. On top of that, expansion is raising the stakes even higher. New franchises mean expansion drafts, protected lists, player movement, negotiated salary cap structures, housing logistics, relocation costs, training camp coordination, arena scheduling, preseason matchups. None of that can function in a vacuum. Without a ratified collective bargaining agreement, there is no official salary cap. Without a salary cap, teams cannot sign players responsibly. Without agreed-upon contract rules, agents won't finalize deals. Without finalized deals, players can't relocate. Without relocation, there are no organized training camps. It's a domino effect, and those dominoes need time. Roughly 60 days may sound like a lot. In reality, for a professional sports league rebuilding rosters and integrating expansion teams, it's barely enough breathing room. If March 10th comes and goes without a deal, you're not just losing a week. You're compressing an already tight schedule into something nearly impossible. Arena dates begin to shift. Broadcast windows become uncertain. Sponsors start asking uncomfortable questions. Players start wondering if their paychecks will arrive on time. Agents begin recalculating strategy. Coaches are left planning for rosters that don't officially exist. And the most important part? The uncertainty doesn't stay quiet. It becomes public. Fans don't follow every clause of a labor negotiation, but they absolutely notice when training camp hasn't opened. They notice when free agency feels frozen. They notice when expansion teams can't announce signings. Suddenly the conversation shifts from percentage disputes to, is the season even happening? That's when pressure escalates. Because once doubt creeps into the public conversation, it spreads fast. Headlines multiply. Social media narratives form. And both sides know something critical. Perception can be just as powerful as contract language. Now here's where it gets even more intense. If ownership sets March 10th as the true operational deadline, they're doing more than setting a calendar reminder. They're signaling that everything after that date becomes exponentially harder and potentially more expensive to fix. In high-level negotiations, deadlines are rarely accidental. They are chosen strategically, not just to create urgency, but to establish control over the pace of events. If one side controls the timeline, they control the emotional rhythm of the negotiation. And when that timeline is backed by logistical reality, expansion teams waiting, free agents in limbo, arena calendars filling up, it becomes more than just leverage. It becomes a countdown. Now imagine being a role player whose contract hasn't been secured yet. You're watching the days pass. You're calculating rent. You're planning relocation for your family. You're unsure whether preseason checks will arrive on time. Suddenly, March 10th doesn't feel abstract. It feels personal. And that's the shift most fans don't see. Because from the outside, this looks like a big-picture debate about fairness and growth. From the inside, it starts to feel like time pressure squeezing individuals in very different ways. Superstars with endorsement deals? They have cushion. Players relying primarily on league salary? They feel every tick of the clock. That imbalance creates something dangerous. Not anger at the opposing side, but tension within your own side. And once tension starts forming internally, negotiation dynamics change completely. But here's the part that makes this even more explosive. Setting a deadline is only the first move. It establishes urgency, yes. But urgency alone doesn't force resolution. What happens next, the strategy layered on top of that deadline, is what determines whether the clock becomes symbolic or becomes a weapon. And that's where this situation shifts from tense to ruthless. A deadline creates urgency. But urgency by itself doesn't end negotiations. Plenty of labor disputes blow past symbolic dates and keep moving. Extensions happen. Temporary frameworks get drafted. Both sides posture publicly while quietly recalibrating behind the scenes. That's normal. What isn't normal is when the clock itself starts carrying financial consequences. Because once that happens, the deadline stops being a calendar marker. It becomes pressure that compounds. And that's the shift that changes everything. Imagine you're sitting at the negotiation table. An offer is presented. You don't love it. You believe you deserve better terms. You hold out. You wait. You strategize. That's how leverage works. But now imagine being told that the offer sitting in front of you doesn't stay the same tomorrow. Imagine being told that waiting doesn't just delay progress. It actively makes your position worse. That's when things start to feel different. In high-stakes corporate negotiations, there's a tactic designed specifically to shatter patience. It's simple in theory, but devastating in practice. You present terms. You attach a date. And after that date, the terms tighten. Slightly at first. Then more noticeably. Suddenly, hesitation carries a cost. And here's why that's powerful. It shifts the emotional center of the dispute. Instead of "we'll wait until they blink," the internal conversation becomes, "How much are we losing every day this continues?" That's a completely different psychological battlefield. Because when time starts draining value instead of preserving it, unity gets tested. Now let's apply that to the current situation. The league isn't just staring at a March 10th logistical checkpoint. It's staring at a moment where financial models, salary structures, housing provisions, and cap calculations must be locked in. If negotiations stall past that window, operational chaos isn't the only risk. Revenue projections shift. Arena contracts get renegotiated. Broadcast obligations tighten. Sponsors grow impatient. The cost of delay begins creeping into the equation. And if ownership chooses to frame that delay as something the union must absorb, that's where internal pressure begins to spike. Because not every player experiences a stalled season the same way. A star with major endorsements? Delays are frustrating, but survivable. A mid-tier veteran? It's uncomfortable. A bench player depending heavily on league salary? It's terrifying. The further the calendar drifts without clarity, the more those layers of financial security start to matter. Now imagine the subtle conversations that begin happening behind the scenes. Text messages between teammates. Quiet agent calls. Questions like, "How long can this realistically go?" No one wants to appear weak. No one wants to fold prematurely. But uncertainty is corrosive. And when uncertainty drags on, it rarely strengthens solidarity. It tests it. This is where negotiation strategy turns cold. Because if ownership believes the longer this stretches, the more internal stress fractures develop, then the timeline itself becomes leverage. Not through public threats, not through loud press conferences, through silence, through patience, through letting the clock do the work. That's what makes this moment so delicate. The public narrative still frames the situation as percentages, 27.5% versus something lower. Housing benefits versus restructuring. Growth versus sustainability. But the private tension isn't about numbers alone. It's about how long each side can endure the uncertainty. And here's the dangerous layer underneath all of it. If the players collectively believe the league won't risk delaying a high-profile season, especially during a peak attention era, then holding firm feels safe. But if the league is willing to tolerate short-term disruption to protect long-term financial structure, then that assumption becomes fragile. Because once one side proves it can endure pain longer than the other, momentum shifts. And that's what makes this stage of negotiations so volatile. Not the public speeches, not the social media debates, the quiet realization inside locker rooms that every passing day might tighten the vice a little more. And the scariest part? The deadline isn't the final chapter. It's just the escalation point. Because when time pressure intensifies and the spotlight grows brighter, the real fracture risk doesn't come from the other side of the table. It starts within. And that's where this situation moves from financial chess match to emotional gamble. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one likes to say out loud. Labor negotiations don't collapse because of press conferences. They don't fall apart because of tweets. They don't implode because of headlines. They crack when the room gets quiet, and people start doing math in their heads. At first, solidarity feels strong, powerful even. There's energy in standing together. There's strength in knowing you're part of something bigger than yourself. That unity becomes the message. But solidarity is easiest when the cost is theoretical. It gets complicated when the cost becomes personal. And that's where this situation starts shifting into dangerous territory. Picture the spectrum inside the locker room right now. On one end, you have stars with endorsement deals, media contracts, long-term brand leverage. A delayed paycheck stings, but it doesn't destabilize their lives. They can afford to think in years. They can afford to push for structural change. They see the big picture. On the other end, you have players whose financial stability is far more fragile. Players planning relocations. Players budgeting around expected season income. Players who don't have multi-million-dollar sponsorship cushions waiting in the background. To them, this isn't about legacy negotiations. It's about certainty. It's about rent. It's about family planning. It's about knowing whether the next 2 months are structured or suspended in chaos. Now add the ticking clock. Every day without clarity amplifies that contrast. And here's where the dynamic becomes explosive. The public fight is framed as players versus owners. But behind closed doors, the emotional stress doesn't point outward. It starts pointing sideways. Teammate to teammate. Agent to executive committee member. Quiet questions begin surfacing. How long are we realistically holding this line? Is this percentage difference worth risking a delayed season? What if the public blames us? What if sponsors start pulling back? No one says it loudly. Not at first. But pressure doesn't need to shout to reshape a room. And that's the hidden vulnerability in any labor dispute tied to a tight operational deadline. The closer the calendar gets to that March checkpoint, the more two internal philosophies collide. One side believes, if we don't push hard now, we lose leverage forever. The other side worries, if we push too far, we risk destabilizing the moment that gave us leverage in the first place. Those are not small disagreements. They're existential, and they don't resolve cleanly. Because both perspectives have logic. Both perspectives have emotion. Both perspectives are rooted in survival, just on different timelines. Now imagine how that tension feels when the entire sports world is watching. When talk shows are debating who's being greedy. When social feeds are assigning blame. When sponsors quietly assess risk. The spotlight doesn't just magnify the league. It magnifies internal doubt. And doubt spreads quickly in uncertain environments. That's the part fans rarely see. From the outside, it looks like stubbornness, like posturing, like ego. From the inside, it feels like calculation mixed with anxiety. Because if March 10th passes without resolution, the narrative won't stay neutral. It won't be both sides couldn't agree. It will become, Who caused this? And once blame becomes a storyline, players feel that heat personally. Especially younger players. Especially role players. Especially those without massive platforms to defend themselves publicly. Now add another layer. Expansion teams are waiting. New markets are preparing. Entire front offices are trying to plan rosters that legally cannot exist yet. If the delay stretches too far, it doesn't just impact veterans. It impacts incoming players, rookies, draft prospects, international talent weighing options. Suddenly, the uncertainty ripples outward. And when ripple effects grow large enough, pressure doesn't need to be applied directly. It becomes ambient, constant, heavy. This is the stage where negotiations become less about spreadsheets and more about stamina. Who can endure longer? Who can absorb more uncertainty? Who cracks first under prolonged ambiguity? That's the silent war happening right now. Not loud, not dramatic, not explosive, but slow, grinding, psychological. And here's where it becomes even more intense. Because all of this is unfolding under one of the brightest spotlights the league has ever experienced. A spotlight that was supposed to empower players. A spotlight that was supposed to increase leverage. But when tension rises and deadlines tighten, that same spotlight can transform into something far more complicated. And that's where the situation shifts again. Because the attention surrounding this league isn't neutral anymore. It's concentrated. It has a face. And it changes the stakes entirely. There's something nobody wants to admit about this moment. The same surge of attention that lifted the league into a new era is now sitting at the center of the tension. Because when a league experiences a cultural explosion, record ratings, sold-out arenas, non-stop media coverage, that momentum becomes more than excitement. It becomes expectation. And expectation changes how negotiations feel. For years, conversations about growth were theoretical. When the league gets bigger, when revenue expands, when national attention increases, now those conditions aren't hypothetical. They're here. Which means the stakes aren't abstract anymore. They're immediate. The 2026 season isn't just another calendar year. It represents continuity. Proof that the surge wasn't a fluke. Confirmation that the audience surge translates into sustainable structure. And that's where the spotlight becomes complicated. Because high visibility doesn't just amplify opportunity. It amplifies risk. If negotiations stall quietly during a low-attention era, the damage stays contained. If negotiations stall during peak visibility, the fallout spreads instantly. Every debate becomes content. Every rumor becomes a headline. Every missed milestone becomes speculation fuel. And that's the tension hovering over this deadline. There's a belief among many fans that ownership would never risk disrupting such a high-profile season. That no executive would gamble with momentum this rare. But business decisions aren't always driven by optics in the short term. They're often driven by structure in the long term. If ownership believes that locking in a financial framework now protects stability for years to come, they may view short-term turbulence as tolerable. That's what makes this moment feel so sharp. Because now the pressure isn't just about percentages. It's about narrative control. If March passes without resolution and preseason preparations stall, the public conversation won't stay neutral. It will start asking, who's responsible? And here's where things get delicate. The players understand the power of the spotlight. They know public support matters. They know perception can influence negotiations. In many modern labor disputes, public sympathy shifts leverage. But public sympathy is fragile. If fans begin fearing a delayed season, especially during a peak excitement window, frustration grows fast. And frustration rarely analyzes the fine print. It looks for someone to blame. That possibility alone changes the emotional climate inside negotiations. Because no player wants to be painted as the reason fans lose games. No player wants headlines suggesting they overplayed their hand, even if those headlines oversimplify the reality. And here's the deeper layer. When one individual becomes the symbolic face of the league's cultural surge, whether intentionally or not, that presence reshapes urgency. The league's newest wave of attention isn't diffuse. It's concentrated. It's recognizable. It's marketable. Sponsors align around it. Broadcasters schedule around it. Casual fans tune in for it. That concentration increases the cost of disruption. If the season starts late or uncertainty drags on, the fallout isn't evenly distributed across the entire league image. It hits hardest at the center of the spotlight, which means the emotional pressure intensifies for everyone connected to that moment. Now imagine being part of a union leadership group navigating this. You're balancing long-term structural demands with short-term optics. You're protecting principles while calculating perception. You're defending fairness while avoiding the appearance of obstruction. That's not simple math. That's high-wire negotiation. And ownership knows that optics cut both ways. If they frame their position as protecting sustainability, while subtly allowing the calendar to tighten, they position themselves as patient. If the union appears to resist compromise as the deadline approaches, the narrative risks shifting. Fair or unfair, accurate or distorted, public opinion rarely waits for nuance. That's what makes this moment feel like a pressure chamber. The deadline is ticking. Internal solidarity is being tested. And the spotlight isn't dimming, it's intensifying. Every day that passes without resolution makes the question louder. Will this season launch cleanly, or will it stumble under the weight of its own momentum? And that leads to the core issue at the heart of everything. Because beyond optics, beyond emotion, beyond deadlines, there's one thing both sides ultimately care about: money structure. And that's where the real collision happens. Strip away the headlines. Ignore the social media debates. Forget the dramatic countdown energy for a second. At its core, this entire standoff comes down to one brutally simple question: who controls the future economics of the league? Because revenue sharing sounds harmless, almost boring, like a spreadsheet conversation that only accountants care about. But revenue structure isn't just about today's paycheck. It's about power. When players push for a larger percentage of gross revenue, they aren't just asking for a raise. They're asking for a deeper stake in long-term growth. They're betting that the league's current momentum isn't temporary, that it will compound. If the pie gets bigger, they want their slice to automatically grow with it. Ownership, on the other hand, doesn't look at that percentage in isolation. They look at volatility, risk exposure, cost control, expansion investment, arena leases, marketing overhead, broadcast uncertainties. They're not asking, what's fair emotionally? They're asking, what protects the asset long-term? And here's the uncomfortable part. Both sides can make rational arguments. Players see surging interest, higher valuations, expansion fees, sold-out arenas. They see growth and believe the structure should reflect it. Owners see operating costs, infrastructure expansion, long-term obligations, and potential downturns. They see volatility and want insulation. The disagreement isn't just about the number. It's about the model. If players secure a higher guaranteed percentage of gross revenue, ownership sacrifices flexibility. If ownership keeps the percentage lower, players feel like they're carrying momentum without sharing enough upside. That tension doesn't resolve easily. Now layer in another flashpoint: housing. To fans, housing provisions might seem like a small perk in a professional league. But inside negotiations, symbolic issues often carry outsized weight. Because housing isn't just about rent payments. It represents security. It represents acknowledgement of logistical realities. It represents how the league values the lived experience of its players. If housing terms shift, players don't just see a line item change. They see a signal. Ownership may frame adjustments as modernization or cost restructuring. Players may interpret them as regression or undervaluing contributions. When symbolic benefits become bargaining chips, emotions escalate quickly. An emotion layered on top of financial structure creates friction that doesn't dissolve overnight. Now step back and look at the broader collision. Expansion is underway. Attention is peaking. The league's valuation is rising. This is precisely when structural frameworks matter most. Because whatever agreement is signed now won't just govern 2026. It will shape the league's economic DNA for years. If the union locks in stronger revenue participation, that compounds as the league grows. If ownership locks in tighter financial guardrails, they stabilize their risk profile moving forward. That's why neither side views this as minor. It's foundational. And here's where the deadline intensifies everything. If negotiations were happening during a quiet off-season without expansion, without peak media focus, without explosive growth narratives, both sides might have more time to maneuver. But that's not the reality. The calendar is tight. The spotlight is bright. And the financial stakes are amplified. That combination is combustible. Because the closer the deadline creeps, the more each side must weigh principle against practicality. Do players push for maximum structural gain and risk short-term turbulence? Do owners concede ground to protect optics and avoid disruption? Or does one side calculate that controlled disruption is acceptable to preserve long-term leverage? Those are the real questions. Not who's greedy, not who's stubborn, but who is willing to endure more short-term discomfort to secure long-term positioning. And if March 10th passes without clarity, the answer to that question won't stay theoretical. It will show up in frozen transactions, in stalled roster announcements, in nervous press conferences, in fans beginning to ask whether opening night is still guaranteed. This isn't just a negotiation. It's a test of endurance, a test of unity, a test of whether the league's biggest momentum wave becomes a launch pad or a pressure cooker. And now everything funnels into one unavoidable moment. Because if the clock strikes and no deal is inked, someone has to absorb the fallout. Which brings us to the final question no one can dodge. Who's actually willing to risk the season to win the structure? And what happens to the league's brightest era if that gamble goes wrong? Here's the scenario no one wants to visualize. March 10th passes. No deal. No signatures. No handshake photo ops. Just silence, and a growing sense that the season clock is no longer theoretical. What happens next isn't dramatic at first. It's procedural. Free agency stalls. Expansion logistics freeze. Draft planning becomes speculative instead of concrete. Training camps hang in limbo. From the outside, it might look like talks are ongoing. But internally, something shifts. Because once a deadline tied to logistics is missed, every day after that isn't neutral, it's damage control. Arena availability becomes fragile. Many venues don't sit empty waiting for clarity. Concert tours, other sporting events, and entertainment bookings move quickly. If scheduling windows close, reopening them isn't simple. Broadcast partners don't operate on vibes. They operate on calendars and deliverables. Advertising inventory is sold months in advance. If uncertainty creeps into scheduling, contingency planning starts quietly. Sponsors don't panic publicly, but they absolutely monitor risk. If momentum slows or narratives turn negative, they adjust exposure. That's how disruption spreads. Not through chaos at first, through slow erosion. And this is where the stakes escalate beyond negotiation tactics. Because now we're not talking about leverage. We're talking about legacy. If a delay becomes real, even a short one, the narrative shifts from hard bargaining to missed opportunity. Fans who just started tuning in consistently begin asking questions. Casual viewers drift back to other sports. Momentum that took years to build can soften in weeks. And here's the brutal irony. Both sides likely believe they are protecting the league's future. Players fight for structural fairness because they believe growth must translate into equity. Owners resist structural shifts they see as risky because they believe stability protects long-term survival. But if the standoff stretches too far, both sides lose something intangible. Trust. Trust between players and ownership. Trust between fans and the product. Trust that growth moments won't implode under pressure. Now let's talk about internal consequences. If a missed deadline leads to delayed paychecks, the locker room tension we discussed earlier doesn't stay theoretical. It intensifies. Role players feel immediate strain. Agents field panicked calls. Veterans who pushed hardest for aggressive demands face quiet scrutiny from younger players just trying to stabilize their careers. That doesn't mean unity collapses overnight, but prolonged uncertainty reshapes dynamics. Leadership becomes harder. Conviction gets tested. And if ownership follows through with firm posture, refusing to soften publicly, the message becomes clear. They are willing to endure short-term fallout to secure their preferred structure. That realization alone forces recalculation. Because now the question shifts from can we win to at what cost? And cost isn't just financial. It's reputational. If fans begin assigning blame, fairly or unfairly, that pressure trickles down. Social media becomes louder. Media narratives sharpen. No player wants to scroll and see comments accusing them of ruining the season. No owner wants headlines suggesting they sabotaged a historic growth era. But here's where things become truly high stakes. If disruption stretches beyond a symbolic delay and turns into a serious schedule adjustment, expansion momentum takes a hit. New markets entering the league want stability. Sponsors in those cities want predictable launches. Front offices building brand new identities need certainty to generate early enthusiasm. A rocky rollout undermines that. And when expansion teams suffer, it affects long-term revenue projections for everyone. That's why this moment isn't just about 2026 tip-off. It's about whether this growth phase cements itself or destabilizes. Now imagine a third scenario. A late compromise. A deal reached just after the deadline, barely in time to salvage structure. That outcome creates a different kind of tension. Relief publicly, resentment privately. Because rushed agreements often leave both sides feeling bruised. Owners may feel they conceded under optics pressure. Players may feel they settled under time pressure. That kind of uneasy peace can carry forward into future negotiations. So no matter which path unfolds, clean resolution, delayed launch, or compressed compromise, this moment leaves a mark. And here's the truth most fans underestimate. The real power of a deadline isn't whether it's met. It's what it reveals. If March 10th comes and a deal is signed, it reveals flexibility. If March 10th passes and both sides dig in, it reveals conviction. If internal cracks appear under pressure, it reveals fault lines that were always there. Deadlines don't create tension. They expose it. And this one is exposing everything. It's exposing how much risk ownership is willing to tolerate. It's exposing how unified the union truly is under financial stress. It's exposing whether the league's brightest spotlight becomes protective or combustible. So now we're staring at the final layer of this entire situation. Not the numbers, not the housing provisions, not the public soundbites, but the willingness to absorb pain. Because at this level, negotiation isn't about winning arguments. It's about enduring consequences. And if the line actually breaks, if the deadline is missed and disruption becomes real, the aftermath won't just decide a season. It will define how power operates in this league for years to come. So the ultimate question remains: who is truly prepared to risk short-term damage to secure long-term control? Because once the clock runs out, there's no hiding what that answer is. Here's what makes this so intense. The 2026 season isn't just another year on the schedule. It's symbolic. It represents continuity of growth. Proof that the surge in attention wasn't a temporary spike. Evidence that expansion, media focus, and rising star power translate into sustainable momentum. But momentum is fragile. If a deal lands just before the deadline, the season launches with tension simmering under the surface. Smiles in public, friction in private. If negotiations drag past that operational window, chaos creeps in. Training camps compress. Narratives turn negative. Fans grow restless. And if things fracture badly enough, the damage wouldn't just hit one season. It would reshape how both sides approach power for years. That's why this moment feels heavier than a standard labor dispute. It's not just about percentages. It's about who defines the league's economic future. It's about whether short-term disruption is worth long-term positioning. And it's about whether unity, on either side, holds under pressure. So now the real question isn't who's right. It's this: when the clock hits zero, who blinks? Does ownership soften to protect the spotlight and preserve momentum? Do players recalibrate to secure certainty and avoid internal fracture? Or does this escalate into a defining standoff that changes the league's trajectory entirely? Drop your unfiltered take in the comments. Do you think the pressure strategy is calculated brilliance or reckless overreach? And more importantly, if the season hangs in the balance, who do you believe ultimately caves when the financial tension becomes real? If you want sharp breakdowns that go beyond surface headlines and dive into the power plays shaping the future of sports, make sure you subscribe, hit that like button, and turn on notifications. Because we don't just follow the drama. We dissect the leverage behind it. And the next move in this standoff could change everything.